Since I'm very frequently asked by students how they should present in seminars, for example, or in the defense of their master thesis or at conferences and workshops, I've decided to upload a short collection of hints that I found useful, at least, and I hope that others may also find them useful. Of course, the first general warning is that there is no strict right or wrong that works for everybody. So none of the advices or hints or whatever that I will give here work for everybody. So you should choose the ones that work for you. And sometimes it's even good or necessary to violate certain rules, which makes a presentation more engaging. However, I start now with my own perspective, and I think the most important advice is that you should not read off your presentation or reel it off by heart and so on and so forth, because that will really bore the audience. So you should prepare your presentation, but speak freely. And what I think is a good advice is that you prepare the presentation by imagining the audience and potential feedback that you get from the audience and preparing your presentation in this way, as if you would give the presentation already to the audience to which you should give the presentation later on. And a very important point here is that when preparing such a presentation and when talking about your subject, you should already check the length of your presentation and ensure that you really remain in time. I think one of the worst things that you can do is to have a very overly long presentation that does not fit into the time schedule that you are allocated to. And the reason is, of course, that at conferences, workshops, and so on and so forth, attendees like coffee breaks and meals much more than presentations usually, unfortunately, but they can get really upset if you take this time from them. So it's really important that you keep the timing, and in conferences, workshops, and defenses and so on, timing is often also very strictly enforced. So really ensure that you can say what you need to say within the time limits that you have at your disposal. Another very important point is that you should avoid having too much text on a slide. So here you don't have a lot of text, but I could have done this slide like this one here, where I would present a very long text that says essentially the same thing. You using a long text on a slide in a presentation can overwhelm the audience, dilute the main points, and lead to disengagement, and so on and so forth. And worst of all is to put a long text on slides and then read it for the audience. This is boring and leads to a strange feeling in presentations. So now I've done exactly that, and I think by now you should exactly know why you shouldn't have a lot of text, why you should rather stick to bullet points, and why you should talk a lot in between and explain the bullet points and not put a lot of text on the slide that you then just read off for the audience. So the points I've made before, they are kind of valid for most of the presentations that we usually have. But the next few points, they are particularly important for academic presentations, but they might not work well in other settings. So if you do a talk for a consulting company or so, then things may be different. But in general, particularly for academic presentations, I would recommend avoiding fancy options, sound effects, and stuff like that in your slides, because that actually is a distraction from what you want to say. In an academic presentation, you usually have to say something, you have some content to deliver, and what you want to do is to educate your audience. The audience is your friend, the audience is not your enemy, and you don't want to impress the audience, you want to educate the audience. And therefore you don't need all these fancy options, if sound effects, or a language that is kind of a marketing or consulting language where you try to persuade somebody or impress with certain jargon or whatever. So you should focus on the content that you have to deliver, and you should really have in mind that you want to educate the audience that is kind of your friend and not your enemy. Sometimes, particularly when you present something that is complicated, it's important that you reiterate and summarize what you are saying in between. using different words and different perspectives, so not to bore your audience to death, but in general to repeat the things so that it really sinks in. And one thing that I do now is to repeat that in preparing academic presentations, you should kind of imagine somebody to whom you present the presentation, and that should be generally an informed person, for example, a set of colleagues or whatever, but this person has not read the paper or know the paper or whatever the topic is that you are presenting. And you should make sure, therefore, that you explain everything very clearly, very concisely, so that after your talk, this person or your colleagues in general will have the feeling that they learned something attending your presentation, that they really go home with a value added. And so you should also use formulas, graphs, tables, and so on, usually in an academic presentation, but you should explain them very well so that all in the audience know what is going on and that they really benefit from you presenting formulas, graphs, and tables. For example, you could present an Euler equation and say, well, this is the Euler equation. Of course, then nobody would get it. And such a formula would rather be a distraction, and maybe even some people who are afraid of mathematics won't like it, and so on and so forth. So what you should do rather is to explain the formula, explain the notation, explain the different parts of the equation, particularly explain the intuition behind the equation, so that afterwards even a person who is not inclined to mathematical expressions thinks that they have learned something by looking at this equation. So for example, I try it differently now. So if this is the Euler equation, then what C is usually consumption. Then a dot over a variable denotes the time derivative of this variable. So what we have then on the left-hand side is the change in consumption in the numerator, the level of consumption in the denominator, and that implies that we have the definition of the growth rate of consumption on the left-hand side of this equation. On the right-hand side, we have the interest rate, denoted by R, and the measure for individual impatience, rho. And now what we see is that the growth rate of consumption is a function of the difference between the interest rate and impatience. When the interest rate is higher than individual impatience, then consumption growth will be positive. And if individual impatience is higher than the interest rate, consumption growth will be negative. What does this mean? Consumption growth means that you are saving. You consume less today and more in the future. And that's the case when the interest rate is higher than impatience. So when the financial market compensates you for your impatience. By contrast, when the financial market is not able to compensate you for your impatience, you would dissave. And dissaving means consuming a lot today and less in the future, or having negative consumption growth. So there, the intuition behind this equation is clear, and I think you can explain this also to people who are not really inclined to see such types of equations. With respect to tables, as an empirical economist, you will often have to present something like this here, where you have different regression models and different variables here. And here the coefficients with the standard errors, and some of them are significant, and so on and so forth. The point is that you know this table very, very well. You've estimated it 100 times and so on. You know how many observations you have, the R squared, and so on. But the people in the audience see this table for the first time, and usually you have just a few minutes to present them what's going on. So what's usually helpful there is if you can highlight certain aspects of the table. So if you're interested, for example, in the effect of variable 1 on your outcome variable, then you can highlight it and the coefficients that you have here and really draw the attention of the audience to this line, and basically thereby to be able to really convey the message that you want to say with respect to this variable, and not having them wander over all the other entries that you have here. Of course, you can also shorten the table. So here, as compared to the previous table, I've just eliminated 3 of the variables and mentioned them as control variables in another line down here. And I just focus on variables 1, 2, and 3. Perhaps these are the variables that the audience should be interested in, or that you want to explain to the audience. and so on and so forth. So this table is then much easier to digest than the table with all the 6 variables and with missing entries here and there and so on and so forth. So the point here is really to use graphs, tables, formulas and so on to convey your message, but to make sure that you really explain them well and that you don't overwhelm the audience with a certain table, with a certain graph, or with a certain formula. Now a few final points on different slides. So slides should have usually short titles that are self-explanatory, which also helps to give the audience a certain structure when they go through your talk. What can also be helpful is to highlight certain important words. So here I highlighted important in bold, for example. You can do other ways of highlighting, of course, but don't highlight too much. So this would then again reduce effectiveness. So in this sentence, of course, almost everything is highlighted. So this is useless. And as I've already said, avoid very long formulas, very large tables, very difficult to understand graphs and so on, and also footnotes. So I think footnotes should not be in slides. Footnotes are something for a text, but in slides they are completely useless usually. And final point, do not include too many slides. Don't come to a presentation when you have 10 minutes to present with 150 slides and then rush through them, or I don't know, after you found out that you only have 1 minute left for your presentation, say, yeah, I will skip these 50 slides or so. Try to adjust the number of slides really to the time that you have for the presentation. You could still have certain backup slides for later, but they should not be seen by the audience when the presentation starts. So this concludes the short overview of hints for presentations. As I said, there are no strict rules, so some of them may not work for you, then just ignore them. Some of them may help you, and I would be happy if they do.